of Environmental Economics. I am your professor, Todd R. Yarbrough, and let's get started. One of the first things I'm going to have you read this semester is a short paper by economists Fullerton and Stavins from 2005 entitled How Economists See the Environment. Now, the main thrust of the paper's argument is that the perception of economists and the economic approach to environmental issues is largely cast around myths, implying that this isn't necessarily how economists view these particular issues. To sort of boil the paper down to its sort of most important point is that economists have a much more nuanced view of markets than is often given credit for. In fact, most people seem to believe that economists think that markets solve everything, and that markets are perfect reflections of value, and that markets are completely efficient. But this isn't really true and hasn't been true for a long time. Economists, for a very long time, in fact, have acknowledged so-called market failures. These are situations in which markets do not achieve the outcomes that society wishes to achieve. And this sometimes calls for things like regulation, government intervention, or some method by which society attempts to clean up the potentially dirty outcomes of markets. Now, let me say that most economists, mainstream economists, are pro-market. In other words, we think markets are important. We think markets can do a lot of really good and cool things. But the fact is that oftentimes markets, because of their nature, and we'll get into this a little bit more later on, are not great at solving issues because they're not decision makers. Markets are, in many respects, simply an aggregate of a bunch of different decisions that are being made simultaneously by consumers and by producers. And sometimes those simultaneous decisions produce outcomes that are negative for individuals, perhaps outside of those markets, but even perhaps for individuals inside of those markets. And this is, of course, mostly true with respect to environmental issues, where the environment historically has been seen as merely an input to the economic system to be used to grow the economy. But for a long time now, economists have been concerned with the relationship between economic growth and environmental degradation and resource degradation. And so what Fullerton and Stavins argue is that this perception of economists as being essentially free market zealots is unfortunate, because economists actually have a lot to say with respect to environmental protection and have a lot of interesting and potentially innovative ways for us to solve environmental issues. And so that's a lot of what their paper talks about. And ultimately, this really helps me kind of frame the issues that we're going to talk about now, but also that are going to carry us through the rest of the semester. So what I'd like to do first is actually frame a bit of history of economic theory and really explain how we got to where we are today with a far more nuanced and enlightened view of the relationship between the environment and economic systems. So if we go back to what we term the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Jean-Baptiste Say, Thomas Malthus, these were economists in the late 1700s, early to mid 1800s, when economics was really just blossoming as its own discipline. I mean, economics obviously had been around since the beginning of human activity. Even some animals have some semblance of economic systems within them, but really thinking about the economy as its own entity, as its own material, if you will, was something that really kind of began in the late 1700s with these economists. And back then, the view of classical economists was that the economy was what we call the circular flow, which you can see here in this particular figure. And the circular flow works exactly like it says it should. That is to say that production production creates things for households to consume. and then when households consume them, they then send money back to producers who then make even more stuff. And so really the way that you grow your economy is by creating this positive feedback loop that says that production creates consumption, consumption creates production, so on and so forth. And then as this occurs, you actually get economic growth spurred on mostly by population growth. So as more people are producing and more people are consuming, then the economic pie grows and grows and grows and grows. At least that's the theory. Back then, economists adhered to what we called Say's law, which was theorized by Jean-Baptiste Say, in which the idea was that supply created demand. Now, this seemingly innocuous idea, supply creating demand, in fact is perhaps one of the most important ideas in human history, because it was the main crux of the policy apparatus during the Industrial Revolution amongst countries. Say's law says that what a country should do is it should simply try to produce as much as possible. And if you look at the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the era that came directly after the classical economists had their largest influence on policymakers, what you would see during the Industrial Revolution was that countries primarily grew themselves by within-country industrial production. Things like steel and coal and railroads and textiles. Countries grew themselves by using their own natural resources they found within their own countries and then producing products within their own countries. And so for a time, Say's law seemed to really hold up to actual economic experience, because as economies produced more things during the Industrial Revolution, their economies subsequently grew. And so this was really the kind of early idea that the goal of economic systems should be therefore to simply produce as much as possible, and then that would spur on consumption. This leads us into the neoclassical economists. So these economists are late 1800s, early 1900s. Alfred Marshall, William Jevons, Arthur Pigou, Leon Walras, and Paul Samuelson. We sometimes refer to these economists as the marginalists, or as creating the marginal revolution. Because what they did was, instead of looking at the economy as one large circular flow, they now began looking at the economy as an aggregate of individual decision making. In other words, instead of thinking about the economy as just production and consumption, let's think about individual decisions as production and consumption. So look at individual firm decision making in terms of how much to produce, looking at individual consumer decision making in terms of how much to consume. From this, we get such classic theories as the theory of supply and demand, for example, which was largely generated by Alfred Marshall in his Principles of Economics, which was first released at the tail end of the 1800s. The idea behind the neoclassical view is a more micro view than the classical. Classical economists are mostly macro view. The neoclassical economists are mostly micro view. And the idea here is that pricing signals, that is, the prices that are paid for by consumers from producers, reflect preferences within the economic system that are efficient under three assumptions. Those three assumptions are that the humans that make up the system are rational. 2, that consumers are maximizing utility or human satisfaction, and producers are maximizing profits, which are revenues minus costs. And 3, that people behave in their own self-interest under full information. What this creates is an economic system which we can characterize by a series of supply and demand curves. Now clearly, we cannot say that this supply and demand represents the entire economic system. What we can say is that this particular framework represents a particular industry. And then we can look at all the various industries, and this gives us an idea of some of the dynamics. One of the things that supply and demand allowed us to do was to look at what happened to prices, right? prices being the main crux of the neoclassical view, we could look at what happened to prices, for example, if the supply shifts out, or if the supply shifts back, and if the demand shifts out or shifts back. Regardless, we can actually look at what the marginal changes were, and really what were the underlying rules of decision making that led individuals to consume, or led producers to produce. Clearly, the neoclassical economists were incredibly influential, given that we still teach supply and demand in economic classes today. So regardless of the fact that the theory has been around for more than 100 years now, doesn't at all imply that economists feel that it is outdated. In fact, what we'll do in this class is we'll utilize supply and demand, and we'll augment it to actually reflect a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss in class.